They told him the past couldn't hurt him anymore, but as he stood in line for his morning coffee and spotted the ink curling along the barista's wrist, everything inside him stopped. It was a symbol no civilian should have known, a ghost mark known only to his fallen sniper unit. That was the moment everything he thought was buried came rushing back to the surface. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Wynn had spent the better part of a decade learning to silence the noise. The late-night echoes, the sudden cracks of phantom gunfire, the weightless absence of the brothers he'd lost. After retiring from the military 4 years earlier, he'd relocated to a quieter town in Montana called Elm Ridge, a sleepy place tucked between pine-covered hills and frostbitten lakes. Here he blended in. No uniform, no salutes, just another guy with salt and pepper stubble, worn boots, and a pickup truck that had seen better days. He taught survival skills to local kids on weekends, helped coach a high school rifle team, and spent the rest of his time hiking the backwoods and keeping to himself. Every Thursday morning, like clockwork, Marcus visited a small coffee shop near the edge of town called Timberline Grounds. It was one of those cozy spots with hand-carved benches and earthy music humming low through vintage speakers. The staff were mostly college students or locals working 2 jobs. They didn't ask questions, didn't probe into the past. It was routine, comforting, a slice of silence before the world stirred. Vikalahu mililofari. But that particular morning in late October was different. The wind had a bite to it, carrying with it the scent of smoke and pine. The usual girl at the counter, Paige, wasn't there. In her place stood someone new. A younger man, maybe mid-20s, with a quiet demeanor and the kind of posture Marcus recognized from years of training. Upright, aware, not just another sleepy-eyed barista pouring lattes. His arms were lean but strong, and his eyes flicked toward the door as Marcus walked in, just long enough to register threat or familiarity. Marcus thought nothing of it at first. He stepped forward, offered his usual nod, and murmured his order. Black coffee, no room. The young man nodded and turned toward the espresso machine, and that's when Marcus saw it. Just below the rolled-up sleeve of the barista's right arm, a symbol peeked out from the cuff of his shirt. It was black and precise, a small raven perched on the hilt of a dagger, surrounded by 7 inked stars arranged in a sharp arc. His breath caught. For a moment, time didn't just slow, it collapsed. That symbol wasn't public. It was never printed, never posted. It was etched into memory and muscle, worn only by the 8 men who'd made up his final covert sniper unit, ECH-07. The ghost mark, as they had called it, had been a promise. A pact made in silence on a mountainside in northern Syria, beneath a blood-red sky and the wreckage of a downed UAV. The unit had fallen in the final year of his deployment. All except him. He had watched the hill burn, listened to the screams cut short by mortar fire, and carried the names of those men in the hollows of his ribs ever since. He blinked, unsure if he was hallucinating. Maybe the years of suppressed grief were finally catching up. Maybe the symbol was just a coincidence, an eerie alignment of ink and trauma. But no, that mark was too exact. The dagger's hilt bore the same subtle curve. The raven's eye held the same shape. Marcus took a step back, his hand instinctively brushing against the scar at his side where shrapnel had once torn through him. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. He simply took the coffee from the barista's hand when it was ready, nodded again, and stepped outside, cup trembling slightly in his grasp. He sat in his truck for over an hour, engine off, watching the reflection of the shop windows in his side mirror. He didn't know the kid's name. He didn't know if this was some kind of cruel joke, a setup, or something else entirely. But he knew, with a soldier's certainty, that this wasn't random. Somewhere buried beneath that barista's calm exterior was a story, one Marcus had never expected to intersect with his own. His past, long buried under silence and distance, had just resurfaced in the form of black ink on a stranger's skin. And, for the first time in years, the weight of not knowing was heavier than the memories themselves. Marcus Wynne had always known how to disappear in plain sight. It was a skill forged not from vanity or paranoia, but survival. In his former life, being seen too clearly could get someone killed. So even in retirement, even surrounded by quiet trees and neighbors who kept to their own, he wore invisibility, like a second skin. He was the type of man people might describe vaguely: tall, maybe 6'1", usually in dark denim or canvas jackets, face like it had been carved from stone, deep-set eyes that never wandered without reason. To some, he might seem weathered, but harmless, like an old wolf too tired to hunt. But there was always something behind those eyes, a slow-burning calculation that never fully dimmed. Marcus didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were chosen like ammunition, deliberate, clean, and built for impact. Born in West Texas but raised mostly on military bases, Marcus had been steeped in discipline before he could spell the word. His father had served 2 tours in Vietnam and returned home with silence stitched into his bones. His mother, a schoolteacher with a quiet kind of steel, had balanced the tension of 2 worlds, the domestic and the militaristic, without flinching. Marcus enlisted at 18, and by 23 he was in a specialized sniper unit after distinguishing himself in a desert campaign with a precision shot that had saved an entire squad. From there, his career unfolded in shadows, classified missions, black sites, places whose names were only whispered. His final unit, Echo 7, had been his family in every way that mattered. 8 men, each hand-picked for a skill set and psyche that could handle the unspoken. Their bond had been forged under fire, in silence, over years of shared danger and invisible victories. But then came the op that ended it all. A mission gone wrong, ambushed, outnumbered, pinned down on the craggy hills near the Turkish border. Marcus had been the last man standing, crawling through stone and blood to extract himself while calling in the airstrike that would erase both friend and foe. The military called it a tactical necessity. He called it a graveyard. The medals they handed him afterward felt like sand in his fists. So when the time came to retire, he didn't fight it. He packed what little he kept, turned down the offers to train future units, and drove north until he hit Elm Ridge. It was a town too small for parades and too proud for pity. He liked that. Nobody asked why he stared too long at doorways before entering, or why he couldn't sit with his back to a room. People assumed what they wanted to assume, that he was a man who had seen some things and was now trying to forget them. His house sat on the edge of a wooded ridge, modest but solid, with a wide porch and a wood-burning stove that crackled through long winters. He kept the place immaculate, not out of pride but principle. Order was one of the few things he could still control. His days were regimented, though no one knew it but him. Wake at 5, run at 6, breakfast by 7, 3 hours of reading or gear maintenance. Lunch. Volunteer work at the VFW hall or survival training for local youth groups. Dinner by 6, then an hour sharpening blades or tuning his old hunting rifle, even if he didn't plan to use it. Sleep was elusive, so he often sat on the porch long after dark, wrapped in an old field jacket, staring at the trees and listening for sounds the forest shouldn't make. Despite the solitude, Marcus wasn't entirely cut off. He had acquaintances. The hardware store owner who knew to set aside extra propane for winter, the retired librarian who let him borrow novels off the record, the kid at the garage who admired his truck and sometimes asked questions about fixing carburetors. But none of these interactions scratched beneath the surface. That was the way Marcus liked it. Conversations were brief, nods were currency, and the past stayed buried. Until that morning at Timberline Grounds, when he'd first started coming to the coffee shop, it had been out of necessity. His old percolator broke during a blizzard, and the shop was the only place open. But over time, the smell of roasted beans and the sound of vinyl records playing in the background became oddly therapeutic. The baristas didn't push small talk, and no one commented on his silence. He liked the consistency of it, the familiar hum of the espresso machine, the clink of cups, the soft thud of boots on hardwood floors. Routine was a balm. It kept the ghosts quiet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. That's why the tattoo shook him so deeply. It wasn't just recognition, it was invasion. A breach into the sacred vault he had spent years locking shut. His first instinct had been denial. Maybe the kid had seen a photo online or picked the symbol from some obscure military folklore without understanding its meaning. But that was unlikely. The ghost mark had never been made public, never issued by command. It was a private emblem, inked only by the men of Echo 7 during a rare night off duty in a remote outpost in Afghanistan. A raven, because they were watchers. A dagger, for precision and silence. 7 stars for each of them. Only 6 of those stars were filled with black. The last one, left hollow, had been meant for him if he fell. He had never told anyone that. And now, here it was, stitched in black on the wrist of a stranger, serving coffee in a town that didn't even exist on most maps. Elm Ridge was the kind of town people stumbled into, not the kind they planned for. Tucked into the basin of pine-covered foothills, it lay at the edge of the Bridger Range, far enough from any major city to keep its name unknown to outsiders, but close enough to civilization that the grocery store carried organic milk, and the local high school had Wi-Fi. The air was crisp most of the year, laced with the scent of wood smoke and pine resin, and the sky stretched wide and unforgiving above, unfiltered by skyscrapers or haze. Main Street consisted of a barber shop, a diner with yellow vinyl booths, a pharmacy that doubled as a gift shop, and Timberline Grounds, the only coffee shop in town that didn't use powdered creamer. Everything moved slower in Elm Ridge, but not lazily. There was purpose in the rhythm here, a quiet respect for the land and the people who had carved out lives from its raw edges. The houses were modest, one-story ranches and A-frame cabins with tin roofs and hand-stacked wood piles. Snow came early and lingered long, so insulation was less a luxury and more a survival necessity. Most homes had backup generators, and every shed stored snow chains and gas cans, like family heirlooms. The roads wound like veins through the hills, unpaved in some stretches, with steep climbs and sharp drops that made winter travel a community effort. It wasn't unusual to see neighbors helping pull each other's trucks from ditches or sharing chainsaws to clear fallen trees after storms. People knew each other's names here. They knew birthdays, the best spots for trout in the river, and who had recently lost a parent or welcomed a grandchild. Privacy was respected, but so was presence. If someone didn't show up for Sunday service or skipped their shift at the gas station, someone noticed. Not with judgment, but with concern. Timberline Grounds sat on the corner of Cedar and 10th, a converted lumber warehouse with exposed beams and a wraparound porch. Inside, mismatched tables and reclaimed wood counters gave it a rustic charm that felt intentional but not curated. Local artists hung their paintings along the far wall, and the baristas wrote quotes on the chalkboard each morning, some philosophical, others just sarcastic. The smell of fresh grounds and cinnamon scones lingered in the walls, and the playlists were always acoustic, never invasive. There were no uniforms behind the counter, just aprons and name tags pinned in crooked angles. The regulars came in at the same time each day, a retired couple who did crosswords together, a young mother with her toddler, 2 high school girls with sketchbooks, and Marcus, who always sat in the back left corner near the bookshelf, filled with battered novels and old issues of National Geographic. The town functioned like an ecosystem, each person playing their role. There was Mary at the post office who remembered everyone's P.O. box number. Dennis at the general store, who swore by a particular brand of hunting socks and would argue with anyone about it. Sheriff Buckley, who barely wrote tickets and spent more time helping clear brush or driving elderly residents to appointments. The community was tight-knit, but not suffocating. Gossip was inevitable, but never cruel. If someone stumbled, there were hands to steady them, but no one pried into the past unless invited, which was part of what made Elm Ridge tolerable for Marcus. It was a town where you could breathe without explaining why you needed to. His house was about 5 miles outside of town, down a gravel road flanked by dense forest. The property had once belonged to an old game warden who left behind a root cellar, a weathered canoe, and an acre of overgrown garden beds that Marcus slowly revived. He had built a shed for tools and a small range for target practice. He kept a fire pit ringed with smooth stones and often sat there in the evenings, letting the crackle of flame replace the sounds that haunted the silence. Wildlife was abundant: deer, elk, the occasional black bear. He shared the land with them in unspoken truce. It was a place of healing, though he never called it that. To Marcus, it was simply quiet enough to hear his own breath again. Les Tourelles, winter was settling in early this year. The leaves had turned fast and fallen faster, leaving bare branches that scraped the sky like ribs. Frost coated the edges of windows in the mornings, and the hills wore a light dusting of snow like a reminder of what was to come. People had begun stacking firewood in earnest, tuning snowblowers, digging out their insulated gloves. At Timberline Grounds, the specials board now listed gingerbread lattes and peppermint cocoa, and a stack of wool scarves appeared on a donation shelf near the door. The sense of preparation hung in the air, not with anxiety but acceptance. Winter came like clockwork, and the town moved to accommodate it, just as it always did. Marcus liked it that way. Predictable, unchanging. That was how he'd kept the past at bay, by surrounding himself with stability. He knew the sounds of his house at night, the way the floor creaked in the hallway, the rhythm of the heater cycling on and off. He knew the path he walked each morning, the bend in the trail where a fallen log marked the halfway point. He knew the faces he'd see at Timberline Grounds, the order they'd call out, the way the sunlight hit the far wall around 9:15 a.m., but the stranger with the tattoo had disrupted that equilibrium. The symbol he saw had injected chaos into his sanctuary, a ripple in the calm surface of the life he had so carefully built. And worse, Elm Ridge wasn't the kind of place where things just happened without reason. The town had a memory, its people noticed. And now Marcus was caught between a past he thought was finished and a present that refused to make sense. Marcus had always believed that the most dangerous kind of conflict wasn't the one that came at you guns blazing. It was the kind that slithered in quietly, unnoticed at first, like a crack in a dam that widened only after everything was already underwater. The days following his encounter with the tattooed barista unfolded with that same slow-brewing sense of threat. At first, nothing overt changed. The coffee shop still opened at 7 a.m., the same regulars filtered in, and the young man, whose name Marcus finally caught from a muffled introduction was Eli, remained behind the counter, quiet and polite. But for Marcus, something beneath the surface had shifted. Every glance, every movement Eli made was scrutinized, measured against memory and instinct. And Marcus didn't like what he was feeling. There was no outward aggression from Eli. That would have been easier. He wasn't smug or suspiciously friendly. He was simply there. But it was the way he moved that Marcus noticed. Too fluid, too aware. His eyes flicked without looking like they flicked. His stance, relaxed, yet always balanced. When he reached for cups or leaned forward to read orders, his core remained engaged. It was all muscle memory, but not the kind you got from yoga or retail. It was military, recent. And that raised a different kind of alarm in Marcus's head. The ghost mark tattoo could have meant any number of things. A tribute, a family connection, even a coincidence. But paired with this behavioral profile, the warning bells clanged louder. This wasn't just some coffee-slinging college kid. Eli had been trained, and Marcus knew what kind of training that was. Worse still, Marcus began to notice other small things. The first came 2 days after the tattoo sighting. As he sat in his truck across the street from Timberline grounds, sipping from a thermos to avoid going inside too soon, he saw Eli walk out the side door. Nothing unusual, employees took out trash all the time. But what caught Marcus's attention was what Eli did next. He didn't just toss the bag into the dumpster and head back in. He paused, scanned, not just a casual look around, but a perimeter sweep. Shoulders squared, neck loose, eyes making 3 calculated arcs across the lot. Then he took a slow breath and went back inside, like it was nothing. That kind of behavior didn't come from working food service. That was protocol. It was tactical. And now Marcus wasn't just intrigued, he was wary. He thought about confronting the kid directly, but his instincts told him to wait. If there was one thing years of covert operations had taught him, it was that forcing a confrontation too early could erase your only chance at the truth. But the question now wasn't just who Eli was, it was who sent him, and why. Marcus had enemies. Not the comic book kind, not assassins waiting in bushes, but bureaucratic ones. People with secrets. People who didn't like that he'd walked away alive when others hadn't. Echo 7's final mission had left more than bodies in its wake. It had left questions, whispers in the halls of command, files that mysteriously disappeared. And Marcus, though cleared and decorated, had left the system with a bad taste in his mouth and a memory he couldn't scrub clean. He hadn't gone public. He hadn't written a tell-all. But he knew things. Things that, in the wrong ears, could burn reputations and unravel carefully built lies. He had buried it all. For his peace. For their families. But maybe someone thought the silence was no longer enough. The second sign came when he visited the VFW hall for a routine meeting. An older vet named Clay, a Korean War survivor with a steel knee and a love for mint tobacco, mentioned that a young man from out of town had been asking questions about military insignia. Clay had brushed it off at the time, assuming it was a kid doing a college paper. But when Marcus asked for a description, Clay said, yeah, he was tall, thin, dark hair, calm eyes. Probably mid-20s. Said his name was Eli. And Marcus knew then this wasn't accidental. But there was another layer that gnawed at him. Eli didn't seem hostile. He wasn't making contact, not probing Marcus directly. He was just there, like a quiet presence hovering around the edge of something, waiting to be noticed. That was what unnerved Marcus the most. This wasn't a hunt. This was a test. Someone was watching to see how he'd react. And in his world, being watched without knowing why was more dangerous than a gun in your face. Shepachas. He didn't talk to anyone about it. Not Clay. Not the sheriff. Not even the woman at the hardware store who'd once served 2 years in the reserves, and sometimes gave him a knowing glance when the news turned grim. Marcus internalized everything. He reviewed old files. He checked his secure lockbox. He even drove 3 hours to a closed bunker site he hadn't visited in years, just to make sure no one had tampered with the storage unit he kept locked beneath the floorboards. Everything was untouched, which meant whatever was happening here, present tense, and Marcus was no longer certain whether this was a warning or a plea. Still, a deeper, quieter voice inside whispered something more unsettling. What if Eli wasn't the threat? What if he was the message? And if that was true, who was the message for? In the weeks that followed, a pattern emerged, one that Marcus both recognized and resented. It was the same rhythm he'd known back in the field, back when surveillance wasn't about satellites and drones, but about human behavior, about clocking a target's smallest tells and waiting for deviation. In Elmridge, the battlefield had no sand or wire fences, but the strategy was the same. You watched, you logged, you waited, and now Marcus found himself slipping back into old habits like they were boots left at the foot of his bed, already broken in and waiting. Every morning, he drove the same route into town. He parked at the same corner across from Timberline grounds, took the same space at the back of the gravel lot, and waited with his coffee in a thermal mug, just out of sight but close enough to observe. Eli was always there by 6:30 a.m., arriving on foot. That struck Marcus as strange. No visible car, no bike. Just a quiet entrance from the alley behind the shop, like he emerged from thin air each morning, steam rising from the vents behind him, as if the earth had breathed him out. Inside, Eli moved with a consistency that was borderline surgical. He cleaned counters in the same order, calibrated the espresso machine at the same time, helped open the register, then retreated briefly to the back room before beginning his shift at the counter. No conversations longer than a few sentences. He didn't joke with coworkers, didn't fumble with machines, and never once looked startled or caught off guard. There was a loop in place, a behavioral circuit Marcus recognized from missions. When operatives were told to blend in under extreme pressure, you followed your role with unwavering precision, not just for camouflage but for protection, because breaking pattern meant exposure, and exposure meant risk. And Eli never broke pattern. Bob Alabakis tested it, subtly at first. One morning, he entered the shop 20 minutes earlier than usual and ordered a tea instead of his typical black coffee. Eli's eyes flicked up, only briefly, before he executed the order flawlessly. Another morning, Marcus took a different seat, closer to the counter, watching for any sign of tension or change. Eli didn't flinch. On the third day, Marcus deliberately brushed past him as he stepped to the condiment bar, lightly bumping Eli's shoulder. A mistake a customer might make. Eli didn't apologize, didn't react, but his left hand, a hand previously at rest, had curled slightly, not into a fist, but into position. Halfway to defense, Marcus saw it, noticed it, filed it away. This wasn't a coincidence. This was discipline. Lecures. Meanwhile, Eli never approached him, never said his name, never asked questions. He served Marcus as if he were just another regular, though Marcus could feel something simmering just under the surface, a recognition that went unspoken. It wasn't hostility. It was waiting, watching. Like Eli was following his own pattern, one that mirrored Marcus's but remained separate by design. It became a kind of Cold War in miniature. Two soldiers orbiting each other in civilian clothes, pretending not to feel the heat from the invisible line drawn between them. Outside of the shop, the tension followed Marcus like smoke clinging to a coat. He found himself waking earlier, double-checking his doors, rewalking the perimeter of his property. He restocked ammunition for his hunting rifle, cleaned his sidearm, not because he expected to use it, but because it calmed his hands. His dreams returned, jagged pieces of memory stitched together into restless nights. The hill, the call for airstrike, the last glimpse of Sergeant Franco yelling over the ridge, blood blooming on his vest. And always, the raven. In his dreams, it wasn't perched on a dagger. It flew above the flames, screeching like a warning too late to heed. The ritual deepened. Marcus began jotting notes again, the way he had during recon. Small details. Times. Dates. Environmental factors. He tracked not just Eli's movements, but the changes in the shop's clientele, employee rotation, the comings and goings of delivery trucks. He sketched out a rough map of the interior layout from memory and observation. It was obsessive, he knew it. But it wasn't about paranoia. It was about order. If there was a truth to be found, it would hide in the pattern. But the longer he studied Eli, the more one detail stood out. The kid didn't deviate. Ever. No anomalies. No missed shifts. No personal phone calls. No signs of leisure. It was unnatural. Not robotic, but managed. Controlled. Like someone performing a role that had been assigned without giving away the script. That was when Marcus began to suspect something else entirely. Maybe Eli wasn't just here to observe or provoke. Maybe Eli didn't come to Elm Ridge on his own. Maybe he'd been placed here, positioned. And that raised a darker question. Who had orchestrated it? Because no one just ends up with a ghost mark tattoo years after the unit that bore it had been wiped out in a classified disaster scrubbed from official records. No one just wears that symbol unless they knew what it cost to earn it. Marcus had never spoken of it, had never shown the symbol to anyone, not even to the woman he'd once thought he might love, back when healing seemed possible. And yet there it was, inked into Eli's skin like a beacon or a trap. The repetition wore on him, the not knowing, the rhythm of normalcy disrupted by the silent threat wrapped in routine. He stopped sleeping, his appetite thinned, he paced more, watched longer, and through it all, Eli never flinched, never spoke more than was needed, never once let the mask slip, until the day he did, shusk, but that was still to come. The first break in the pattern came not from Eli, but from someone Marcus had almost forgotten. Her name was Della Hart, and she showed up like a memory that had decided to become real again, walking into Timberline grounds one overcast morning, wearing the same stubborn expression he remembered from a decade ago. Della hadn't changed much, though her hair was shorter now and streaked with silver near the temples. She moved with a purpose, boots hitting the floor with the kind of grounded certainty that came from too many deployments and not enough apologies. She wasn't the kind of woman people overlooked. She didn't wear fatigue anymore, but her posture still read military. Her eyes scanned the room before she ordered, not paranoid, just trained. Marcus recognized it instantly, the way you recognize a language you used to speak fluently. He hadn't seen her since Germany, since they'd stood side by side in a debriefing room filled with fluorescent lighting and half-truths. She'd been military intelligence, embedded with Echo 7 on 2 separate missions, trusted because she never overstated her purpose and never asked questions she didn't already know the answers to. She was the only non-combatant Marcus had ever seen hold her ground during a mortar strike, calmly updating coordinates while chaos erupted around her. They had shared more silences than words, but those silences had meant something. When the unit fell, Della had been one of the few cleared to read the after-action reports. She had called him once after the mission, voice low and unreadable, asking if he was sure he wanted to retire completely. He'd said yes, and that was the last time they'd spoken. Until now, Marcus saw her before she saw him. She ordered something complicated. He heard oat milk mentioned, and then turned to scan the seating area. Her eyes caught his almost immediately. Not by chance, but because she'd clearly known where to look. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just moved toward him, coffee in hand, and sat across from him like she belonged there. He didn't ask what she was doing in Elmridge, and she didn't volunteer it, but her presence alone told him what he'd already begun to suspect. This wasn't about coffee. This wasn't about coincidence. This was bigger. For a while they just sat. Eli was behind the counter, as usual, and Marcus noted that he didn't seem surprised by Della's arrival. He kept his eyes down, movements measured, but Marcus could feel the undercurrent. Recognition, maybe. Or expectation. The pieces had been moving for a while, and now someone had arrived to flip the board. Eventually, Della spoke, her voice low enough to be swallowed by the ambient hum of the shop. She asked how he was sleeping. A loaded question. He didn't answer. She asked if he'd noticed the mark. He said yes. She nodded, as if confirming something that had been theoretical until now. She didn't say Eli's name, but Marcus could tell she knew it, knew more than she was letting on. She told him there were files that had never been closed, that someone had been tracing the threads of Echo 7's legacy long after the military had declared it resolved, that the ghost mark had resurfaced, once in Florida, again in Nebraska, and now here, each time on someone too young to have ever served with them, and each time paired with classified behavioral patterns no civilian could have picked up on naturally. Della wasn't here by accident. She had followed the signs, and she wasn't alone. Marcus felt the air shift around them. For the first time, he wasn't just a retired soldier watching a strange kid with a familiar tattoo. He was a participant again, tangled in something still alive. Something unfinished. Della told him that Eli had no official records before the age of 15. No birth certificate, no school transcripts. His background appeared out of thin air, like someone had written it deliberately, inserted it into systems just enough to pass casual inspection. That level of fabrication didn't come cheap, or from amateurs, which meant Eli was either part of something classified or something broken loose from what was once classified. Either way, he wasn't just some wandering tribute bearer to a fallen sniper team. He was carrying something. A message. A connection. A mission. But Della had one more detail, one that chilled Marcus deeper than the rest. She showed him a photo on her phone, covertly angled beneath the table. Grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. It was Eli, not at Timberline grounds, but standing in front of a stone monument in Fort Bragg 3 years earlier, the place where Echo 7's memorial plaque had been installed. He was staring at it with a look that was neither grief nor confusion. It was reverence, familiarity, as if he'd been standing at the grave of someone he'd known. Marcus stared at the image until the edges blurred. There were things he had forgotten to grieve, names he had pushed down so far they'd become weight instead of memory. And now, this boy, this ghost with a tattoo, had walked into his sanctuary carrying all of it like a silent offering. Della said she didn't know yet what Eli wanted, but she was certain of one thing. He wasn't here by mistake. Then she left. No hugs, no goodbyes. Just the scrape of a chair and the soft click of boots walking out into the fog. Marcus sat there long after she'd gone. The image of Eli at the memorial burned into his mind like an afterimage. The mystery hadn't been solved. But now, it had a witness. And for the first time since seeing that ink, Marcus realized this wasn't just about what he was seeing. It was about what he was being asked to remember. 3 days passed before the moment revealed itself. Marcus had returned to his routine, but not to find comfort, only to prepare himself. Everything now felt like the breath before a storm, the way the wind stalls and the birds vanish. The morning fog was thicker than usual, clinging to the streets like smoke that wouldn't rise. He sat in his truck again, parked across from Timberline grounds, watching through the windshield as condensation slowly crept down the glass. Inside, the shop buzzed with its typical rhythm, cups clinking, espresso hissing, someone quietly laughing near the window. But Eli was different today. There was something in his stance that had changed. He moved slower, not in laziness but with deliberation. His eyes scanned the room more often, and once, just once, they met Marcus's through the pane of glass, holding for half a second longer than usual before dropping away. That look didn't ask for permission, it invited a reckoning. Marcus entered just after 9. The shop was busy, but he moved with purpose, ignoring the usual nods from regulars and going straight to the counter. Eli was the only one there. The second barista, a chatty college girl who usually worked mornings, was absent. Their eyes locked again as Marcus reached the counter. He ordered his usual, but his tone was different. Firm, intentional. Eli nodded, began preparing the drink, but Marcus didn't look away. He watched every movement, studying the way Eli's hands moved, the way he reached for the tamper, how his forearms flexed beneath the rolled sleeves of his black shirt. And there it was. When Eli turned slightly to grab a cup, his left wrist bent just enough to reveal the full tattoo again, bold, deliberate, and now unmistakable. The ghost mark. The raven's wings were spread wide, the dagger piercing downward. But what Marcus hadn't seen before, what chilled him now, was the addition beneath it. 7 stars, just like theirs had been, but all 7 were filled in, black, permanent, including the last one. The hollow star that Marcus's own ink had left empty in quiet hope, now inked dark like a grave that had finally been filled. Eli set the drink down and said Marcus's name. Not sir, not mister, just Marcus. Like it belonged to him. Marcus's stomach turned cold, Not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't admiration. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional. And it was time. Vensahai. Mensaha seir bostach akacha chika. Mensaha petis wasn't time. He took his drink, stepped aside, but didn't leave. Instead, he walked to the bookshelf at the far wall, pretended to browse, then turned and leaned against it, facing Eli across the room. He waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At exactly 9:20 a.m., Eli untied his apron, handed it to the manager with a quiet word, and walked around the counter. He didn't head for the front door. He walked straight to Marcus. Without asking, without blinking, he stood beside him and nodded toward the side entrance. Marcus followed. Guy. Outside, the cold air bit at his face, the fog curling around the corners of the building. Eli stopped near the dumpster where they wouldn't be heard. Then, without hesitation, he pulled up the sleeve of his left arm and turned it fully to Marcus. It wasn't just the ghost mark. Beneath it, etched in small but precise lettering, were the names of all 7 Echo 7 members: Franco, Mills, Ortega, Bishop, Kwan, Henry, and finally, Wynne. Marcus stared at the last name, frozen. He hadn't written that name anywhere since the mission. Not in journals, not in letters. He had let the world forget it. Yet here it was, inked like a vow. He looked at Eli's face then, not as an observer, but as a man seeing through fog to something solid. And for the first time Eli spoke with weight. He said he had waited long enough. He said he knew who Marcus was before he ever set foot in Elm Ridge. He said the ghost mark had been given to him by someone who survived longer than the military had claimed. And that was when the world tilted sideways. Marcus's breath caught, because as far as he knew, no one else had survived that day. He had been the last one out, the one who called the strike, the one who dragged his body through stone and blood to the extraction point. The reports had confirmed it. The bodies had been recovered, except Franco's, whose remains had never been located, but had been declared KIA nonetheless after extensive search and confirmation. But now Eli was saying otherwise, that someone from Echo 7 had lived, not just lived, but passed the mark on. Marcus demanded a name, even before the words left Eli's mouth. But he already knew. Franco. Eli nodded. It unraveled inside Marcus like a tight coil snapping loose. Sergeant Daniel Franco had been Marcus's partner through most of their operations, the man who watched his 6 without question. If Franco had survived, even briefly, long enough to pass something on, to find someone, then everything Marcus believed about that mission had been compromised. The guilt, the finality, the silence, all of it. And now Eli stood before him as living proof of a truth that had been buried under flags and classified files. Bills. The recognition wasn't just of the tattoo, or the behavior, or the name. It was of a legacy. Eli wasn't just a mystery. He was a continuation. A message. A living echo of something Marcus had tried to put to rest. He felt it now, not just in his mind, but in his blood. That mission hadn't ended. It had just gone quiet. Until now. The air between them was no longer just cold. It was sharp, electric, as though the very molecules carried a charge neither of them could ignore. Marcus didn't speak immediately. He needed the silence to catch up to the flood of implications now crashing against every wall of his mind. If Franco had survived, even briefly, it would mean years of misinformation, or worse, deliberate concealment. It meant Marcus had grieved a ghost based on incomplete truth, had buried his own command under a narrative someone else had authored. It also meant Eli wasn't just here to connect. He was here to confront. Whether he knew it or not, he had become the living embodiment of Marcus's unfinished war. And now that war was knocking on his door in the form of a soft-spoken barista, with a sniper's bearing and 7 black stars inked beneath his skin. Marcus finally asked Eli the one question that had been forming since the moment he saw the tattoo. "Who gave you the mark?" He expected hesitation, deflection. But Eli answered without pause. He said the name again, Franco, and added that it had happened in a cabin deep in the Kaibab Plateau, where Franco had lived in hiding for 2 years before succumbing to his wounds. Marcus nearly staggered from the words. It wasn't just the revelation that Franco had survived. It was the imagery. Franco, the heart of their unit. The man who always kept morale alive in the mud and fire of the mission, dying alone in the Arizona wilderness, unknown to the world that thought him long gone, training a boy, passing on their legacy in silence. It was too much, too surreal. And yet Marcus saw no deceit in Eli's eyes, only the solemn steadiness of someone raised on purpose, molded by grief, and delivered with care to the doorstep of a man who had tried to disappear. Marcus's fists clenched without thinking, not in anger toward Eli, but at the invisible architects behind all of this. Who had let Franco fall off the grid? Who had scrubbed the records? Who had ignored the signs of survival and closed the file with a stamp and a lie? He demanded answers Eli didn't have. The kid knew the personal pieces, not the institutional ones. He only knew what Franco told him before the final hour: names, dates, tactics, rituals. He had memorized the call signs of the fallen, the last known transmission logs, the unofficial rules of Echo 7 that had never been written down. Eli wasn't just a student. He was a vessel, a walking memory archive crafted in shadows. And now he was here, standing across from Marcus, not to challenge his authority, but to test his truth. But Marcus couldn't accept it. Not all at once. There was too much rage behind the years he'd spent trying to believe the silence was honorable. He had marched at Franco's memorial, delivered the final salute. He had looked Franco's sister in the eyes and told her there was nothing left to recover. And now he was being told that somewhere Franco had breathed, bled, and died again, unheard and unseen. Marcus shouted, not at Eli, but at the universe, at the betrayal, at the manipulation of memory. He accused Eli of being a pawn, of being used. He questioned the validity of every detail. And Eli took it all, eyes steady, never stepping back, never raising his voice. He had trained for this moment, clearly, prepared not just for resistance, but for rejection. And that disturbed Marcus more than anything, because that kind of resilience only came from someone who had already been tested beyond normal limits. The escalation wasn't about weapons or threats. It was about pressure, emotional, psychological, spiritual. Marcus wanted to dismiss Eli, wanted to retreat into the fortress of his isolation, but he couldn't. Not after seeing the names, not after hearing the word kebab, not after feeling that terrible twist in his chest that only comes when truth slams into long-held fiction. And Eli didn't push him. He simply stood there, presenting himself like evidence, waiting for Marcus to stop denying what his instincts already knew. Later that evening, Marcus stood at the range behind his cabin, firing into the cold wind, letting the recoil shake loose whatever emotion hadn't yet been spoken. He fired until his arms ached, until his vision blurred, until the sound of each shot became indistinguishable from the echo of Franco's voice in his head. Then he dropped to his knees in the snow, breath steaming, and whispered the name one last time like a prayer: Franco. If the man had really survived, if he had really passed on the ghost mark, then the only way forward now was to uncover the why. Why had he been left to die in obscurity? Why had no one searched harder? Why had the mark been passed on like a cursed inheritance instead of a badge of honor? And why, after all these years, had Marcus been chosen to carry the truth? The next day, Eli returned to the shop, apron tied as usual, routine unbroken. But when Marcus walked in, something had changed. They didn't speak, didn't nod. But Marcus saw it in Eli's stance, in the way he shifted just slightly when Marcus approached. There was no longer a wall between them, no longer a question of if, only of what came next. Nod. The confrontation had passed. Now came the unraveling. Lure. The thaw between them was not immediate. It came in flickers, like early spring sunlight, pushing through the cracks of a long, brutal winter. But Marcus felt it, undeniable and persistent. There was no longer fear in Eli's presence, nor distrust. What remained between them now was the quiet understanding, born from shared burden. They were two men, bound by a legacy neither of them had chosen, and both of them had inherited. And with the confrontation now behind them, it was time for Marcus to do what he hadn't done in years, step back into the fray, not as a ghost of a soldier, but as the man Franco had once believed he could be. It began on a Saturday morning, one unusually bright for February, when Eli showed up at Marcus's cabin unannounced. He didn't knock, just waited on the porch, arms folded, expression still. Marcus opened the door slowly, expecting hesitation or more conversation. But, instead, Eli held up a small, cloth-bound journal. Marcus took it without a word, fingers grazing the worn edges of the canvas. Inside were sketches, notes, diagrams, military shorthand mixed with hand-drawn terrain, symbols, coordinates. And, at the bottom of the first page, the unmistakable, looping scrawl of Daniel Franco. Marcus sat down on his porch step, his heart pounding. This wasn't just proof. It was a confession, a message passed from one life to another through the inked hands of a boy who had never known combat but carried its ghosts in his bloodstream. The journal contained what Franco had managed to piece together before his death. Not just about ECH-07, but about what had gone wrong, why their mission had been sabotaged from within, why extraction was delayed, why 3 radio calls went unanswered. Franco had suspected someone higher up, an officer whose name appeared several times in the margins, had manipulated the mission parameters to serve an agenda no one in Echo 7 was told about. There were implications of a covert weapons test, a ghost op layered beneath their own. The unit had been sacrificed not by chance, but by design. The strike Marcus had called had saved his life, but it had also buried the truth, permanently silencing what could have become a scandal. And Franco, wounded and somehow left behind in the initial sweep, had crawled his way to a civilian outpost, survived on instinct and rage, and passed on everything he could before his body gave out. He gave it to Eli not because the boy was trained, but because the boy was there, the son of the medic who found Franco. The child who had listened wide-eyed as a dying man recounted the legacy of a sniper unit that no longer existed, the one who had memorized the names, the principles, the mission, who had chosen to carry it forward. Marcus read until his eyes burned. He read through pages that implicated men he had once saluted, through timelines that contradicted his own memory, through pain etched so deeply into the ink that it felt like Franco's final breath had pressed the pen itself. And when he finished, he looked at Eli again, really looked at him. He saw not a threat, not a symbol, not a mystery. He saw the son Marcus never had, shaped not by blood, but by intention. This boy had been made from the wreckage of Echo 7, and now Marcus had a choice: walk away again, or finally stand up and do what Franco had asked without asking, finish what was started. None. He didn't speak his decision, he demonstrated it. That afternoon, Marcus opened the locked storage trunk buried beneath his toolshed. He hadn't touched it in years. Inside were his old uniforms, his gear, and the battered M40A5 sniper rifle that had once been his lifeline. He pulled it out carefully, inspecting the stock, the scope, the balance. Then he set it on the table in front of Eli, not to show off, not to intimidate, but to teach. The first lesson was simple: field strip and reassemble. Eli knew most of it already, but Marcus corrected the details, refined his grip, adjusted his timing. Then came posture, breath control, trigger discipline. Day bled into night as the yard became a training ground, and for the first time in years, Marcus felt his bones hum with purpose. In the days that followed, they ran drills, analyzed maps, cross-referenced Franco's notes. With recent reports Marcus quietly pulled from old contacts in D.C. They built timelines, reconstructed movements. They even visited the Kaibob cabin, now abandoned but still echoing with the presence of the man who had made it a final command post. Marcus stood there in the quiet pine air, looking at the marks etched in the walls, the makeshift cot, the boxes of rations still untouched. It was real. Franco had lived, had fought to stay alive not for himself, but to pass the mission forward. Sowa. And now Marcus was passing something forward too. Not revenge, not anger, but clarity, responsibility, a chance to right something buried in shadow. He told Eli what it really meant to carry the mark. Not the ink, but the truth. The discipline, the mercy when necessary, the restraint. He told him that being a ghost didn't mean disappearing. It meant being the last flicker of light when all else went dark. It meant showing up, silently, when no one else would. And Eli listened, absorbed, practiced, not as a boy, idolizing a hero, but as a soldier stepping into a duty he now understood in full. By the end of the week, Marcus knew he had passed the test. Not Eli's test, his own. He had stood in the face of his guilt, stared into the eyes of the mission he thought had killed him, and chosen not to run. He had proven, finally, who he really was. Not the broken shell who lived alone with too many secrets, but the last man standing from Echo 7, still fighting in the only way that mattered, by making sure the truth had a future. The decision to go public didn't come suddenly. It was a slow, grating process, like loosening rusted bolts that had been frozen in place by time and fear. Marcus had lived too long in the shadows of classified silence, a man bound by non-disclosure agreements and internal codes that once made sense in the battlefield but now felt like shackles tethering him to someone else's version of the truth. But Franco's journal had broken something loose inside him. It wasn't vengeance he sought. It wasn't even justice in the conventional sense. It was recognition, not for himself, but for the truth, for ECHO7, for the men and the mission they had died for, and for the ones who had orchestrated their erasure from the inside. The plan was simple, but its implications ran deep. Delahart returned to Elmridge, this time not in secrecy, but with full intention. She was still with military intelligence in a limited consulting capacity, but she had built enough rapport, and more importantly, enough leverage to know how to get sensitive stories in front of the right eyes. Marcus handed her Franco's journal without hesitation. She didn't ask him if he was sure. She knew he was. The truth had become too heavy to carry alone. They made copies, one for her, one for a retired colonel who had since become a whistleblower advocate, and one that Marcus kept for Eli, sealed in a metal box with a note that simply read, "If anything happens to me, you tell it." It started with a letter. Marcus composed it by hand, the old-fashioned way, each stroke of ink deliberate, like pulling thread through scarred fabric. The letter was addressed to a small group of investigative reporters, known for uncovering military scandals with precision and integrity. In it, he laid out the broad strokes, his name, rank, the unit, the year it fell apart. He referenced the mission gone wrong, the classified extraction, the silence that followed, and the sudden reappearance of a symbol no one outside the team should have ever recognized. He attached photographs of Franco's journal, redacted only where necessary for operational security, and included 2 testimonials, his own and a digital scan of Franco's final written page. The media team responded within hours. 9. The vetting process took days, then weeks. Marcus submitted to interviews, background checks, polygraphs. He showed his scars, both visible and not, Della corroborated everything she could. Other former officers came forward too, spurred by the emerging trail of inconsistencies that had been hidden behind walls of bureaucracy and need-to-know clearance. One by one, the old barriers started to erode. And then, it happened. The story ran. It wasn't front-page news at first. It began as a deep-dive feature in an independent military affairs journal, but the title was impossible to ignore. The Forgotten Unit, Echo 7's Real Story, and the Man Who Returned with the Truth. It spread quickly. Within 48 hours, major networks were reaching out. By the end of the week, congressional committees were quietly requesting internal files. And then, the dam broke. A second whistleblower came forward, a former logistics coordinator who confirmed that the equipment manifests for Echo 7's final mission had been altered post-operation. A third source, a drone operator from the support base, revealed that he had been ordered to suppress real-time footage from the hillside where Franco had last been seen. What had once been speculation had now become verifiable, tangible, unstoppable. And at the center of it all was Marcus Wynn, the sniper who had disappeared into civilian obscurity, now standing before cameras in plain clothes, voice steady, refusing to play hero. He didn't want medals, he didn't want praise, he wanted names, he wanted the mission declassified, he wanted Echo 7's story told properly, so the men he had bled beside could be remembered not as footnotes in a redacted document, but as soldiers who were led into something darker than any of them had signed up for. When the official investigation launched, Marcus testified in front of a closed-door Senate committee. Eli sat in the gallery, silent, watching. The ghost mark now inked on national consciousness had become a symbol not of revenge, but of remembrance. People began showing up to veteran events wearing small raven pins on their lapels. The fallen names of ECHO 7, once stored only in Marcus's fading memory and Franco's dying hand, were now etched into a new memorial wall, unveiled under an autumn sky with full honors and televised ceremony. Marcus stood in front of it, hands clenched behind his back, watching as the names were read aloud by someone who had never known them but who now spoke them with reverence. For the first time in years, Marcus allowed himself to close his eyes and listen, and then came the apology. It wasn't from a general or a president. It came from a man named Henderson, a former field operative turned policy chief, who had once rubber-stamped the redactions that sealed Echo 7's fate. In a private meeting arranged by Della, he looked Marcus in the eye and said the words no one else had dared to utter. "We failed you." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. The facts were already speaking louder than the regrets. But as he left that room, Marcus knew something had shifted. The silence had finally cracked, and through it had poured a torrent of truth, so long buried it had started to fossilize. Now it was free. Hamshia Lowry. Eli watched all of it unfold, with a calm Marcus hadn't expected. He never once asked for the spotlight, never told his side of the story to the press. He remained the quiet keeper of a fallen soldier's legacy, content to let Marcus take the heat, the questions, the burden. But in every step Marcus took, from handing over the journal to standing in front of the memorial, Eli was there, watching, learning, waiting, not for closure, but for what came next. Because the truth was no longer hidden, but the fight for what it meant had only just begun. In the weeks following the story's explosion into the national eye, the atmosphere around Elmridge shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Timberline grounds saw more foot traffic, but not because of its coffee. Veterans, journalists, and curious civilians filtered in, some just to look, others to speak quietly with the barista, who had become a symbol of something far larger than himself. Eli handled it all with the same composed precision that had always defined him. He took orders, brewed lattes, answered questions only when asked directly, and never gave more than necessary. But something in his demeanor had changed. It wasn't arrogance or pride. It was grounding. He no longer moved like someone waiting for a mission to start. He moved like someone who had found his position, his place, and knew exactly why he was there. For Marcus, the aftermath came like waves. Some expected, some crashing out of nowhere. Old comrades he hadn't heard from in years reached out, some with trembling voices, others with quiet fury. One had seen the broadcast from a VA center in Nevada and broke down in tears for nearly 20 minutes on the phone, repeating Franco's name over and over like a prayer that had finally been answered. Another sent him a handwritten letter, simply saying, "You gave us back our brothers." There was power in that. But there was also weight, because while truth had been set loose, it hadn't come without cost. The Department of Defense opened an internal review of all operations connected to the Echo 7 deployment and its surrounding black sites. A handful of names quietly resigned. Others disappeared into early retirements. A few were formally charged with falsifying reports or obstructing post-mission analysis. It wasn't a public reckoning in the way some had hoped, but it was movement. A shift. A crack in the fortress. Marcus didn't celebrate it. He observed it. The system rarely apologized outright, but it bled its guilt through paperwork and public silence. And Marcus recognized that for what it was, a form of surrender from a structure too proud to kneel. Locally, the town of Elm Ridge responded with quiet respect. The mayor invited Marcus to a town hall to speak, which he declined, but Eli went in his place. He stood before a small group of townsfolk, veterans, students, and business owners, and told them about Franco. About a man who refused to let a lie become his legacy. He spoke not of tactics or missions, but of purpose, of how one man's final days had seeded something much larger than survival, how memory, when carried correctly, could become a map. By the time he finished, the room had gone silent in that sacred way reserved only for moments of truth that demand reflection. He didn't linger. He just nodded once, stepped off the stage, and walked back to the coffee shop. The applause came only after the door closed behind him. For Marcus, the largest shift happened internally. His mornings no longer began with the same dread. The fog that once clung to his lungs when he awoke now lifted more quickly. He still dreamed, but the dreams had changed. They no longer ended at the blast crater. Sometimes, now, they picked up after. In the quiet. In the possibility that survival meant more than guilt. He began meeting with younger veterans through a discreet group Della connected him to. He never introduced himself as anything more than Marcus. Never mentioned the article, unless they did first. He just listened. Shared when it felt right. Advised when they asked. For the first time since retiring, he felt like a soldier again. Not in uniform, not in combat, but in service. One afternoon, Eli brought him a box. It was wooden, hand-carved, and inside were photographs. Some were of Franco in the cabin, his face thinner, but still familiar. His eyes sharp, even as his body failed. Others were maps, pages from another journal, and 2 faded Polaroids of Eli as a boy standing beside a man with a bandaged leg and a rifle across his lap. Marcus sat with them for hours, touching each one like a relic. The truth had been buried for so long, and now it was laid bare on a kitchen table in a cabin that once served as a hiding place. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just sat, letting the weight of it all pass through him like wind through broken branches. News outlets moved on, as they always did, chasing newer controversies and louder chaos. But the ripple Echo 7 had caused didn't disappear. It sank deeper. Veterans began sharing their own suppressed stories, forgotten missions, mysterious orders, unexplained deaths. A movement began, quiet, grassroots, unpolished. They called themselves the Silent Marks. A network of former soldiers, intelligence operatives, and advocates who had been branded by the decisions others made for them, and who were now reclaiming their own narratives. Marcus was invited to lead it. He declined. But he sent Eli in his place. Éveillé. Eli accepted, but only on one condition: that the legacy of Echo 7 not become a crusade, but a compass. Not about exposing the system for vengeance, but guiding the lost back toward their own truths. He said if Franco had taught him anything, it was that memory wasn't meant to weigh you down. It was meant to show you where to go next. Marcus heard that and nodded. The boy had already surpassed the teacher. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long, amber shadows across the hills of Elmridge, Marcus stood at the edge of the ridge near his cabin, rifle slung over his shoulder, not out of habit, but remembrance. Below, the valley lay still, the town quiet, the world moving on. But within him, the storm had calmed. Echo 7 would never be forgotten. The men, their sacrifice, the silence they endured, it had been broken now, not with a shout, but with steady truth carried by a boy with a tattoo and a man who had finally chosen to stop running. And in that stillness, Marcus finally understood that aftermath didn't mean the end. It meant the beginning of whatever came next. The seasons shifted gently over Elmridge, but the ripple of what had occurred never truly settled. Legacy, Marcus had come to realize, was not defined by medals or records or the pages of official history. It lived in moments passed down, in choices made when no one was watching, in the quiet conviction that truth could outlast time if enough people were brave enough to carry it forward. The fallout from the revelations surrounding Echo 7 had long reached their peak and begun to descend into something more lasting than headlines. It had transformed into movement, memory, momentum. Across the country, small groups of veterans, survivors, and truth-seekers began gathering under the banner of the Silent Marks, not as a militant group or a protest, but as a collective of conscience. They met in VFW halls, in church basements, in coffee shops not unlike timberline grounds. They shared stories that had never been spoken aloud. They brought journals, old radio logs, fragmented recordings, faded letters. For the first time in decades, these scattered ghosts of forgotten missions began finding each other. Not all their stories would ever see the light of congressional hearings or televised specials, but that wasn't the point. The point was acknowledgement, witness, restoration. Marcus, despite his central role in sparking the fire, stepped into the background with quiet grace. He still met regularly with Della, whose connections continued to open doors, though now she too had transitioned from intelligence to advocacy. Together, they consulted on legislation designed to protect whistleblowers in military service and provide resources for families of units lost in classified operations. It was slow work, governmental change always was, but progress had its own pulse, and they learned to trust it. Marcus rarely traveled outside Elmridge, but his influence stretched far beyond its wooded borders. His story, his testimony, his truth had become a foundation others could stand on. And still, he remained a presence in the shadows, offering guidance without spotlight, pushing others forward while standing just behind the curtain. Eli, on the other hand, grew into his role with quiet certainty. As word spread and the Silent Marks gained structure, he became its symbolic center, never calling himself a leader, but often being treated like one. His youth, balanced by a gravity well beyond his years, drew people to him. He didn't give speeches or demand attention. He simply lived the legacy. He worked part-time at Timberline grounds still, and those who visited often found him there, sleeves rolled, hands steady, always listening. There was a moment that solidified his place in the greater narrative, though he would never speak of it himself. It happened during a retreat hosted for second-generation veterans, sons and daughters of those lost in service, those struggling to understand the weight their parents had carried. During a quiet campfire discussion, a girl no older than 17 broke down sobbing after describing the night her father died in an operation she was told never happened. She said she had no photos, no grave, just a folded flag and a redacted death certificate. When the silence fell over the group, Eli stood, walked to the fire, and removed his jacket. Slowly, he rolled up his sleeve and held his arm out, letting the flames reflect off the ghost mark tattoo. Then he knelt before her and said only one sentence, "You're not crazy for remembering what no one else was allowed to." That girl would later become one of the most vocal advocates for military family declassification reform. She credited Eli with giving her a voice when all she had was a whisper. Legacy moved like that. Quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. Even the military began to shift in its own slow way. Training manuals were updated to include sections on ethical reporting and mission accountability. Counseling services for soldiers involved in sensitive deployments were expanded. And in one of the more symbolic gestures, the Department of Defense issued a formal commendation to the families of Echo 7, not posthumous medals, but letters of recognition, validating their service and confirming what had once been buried. Marcus received his copy in a plain white envelope with the DoD seal in the upper corner. He didn't frame it. He folded it neatly and placed it in the same wooden box that held Franco's journal, the old Polaroids, and a patch from his final deployment. Not for display, for preservation. Back in Elmridge, the memorial wall became a quiet place of pilgrimage. Not grand or ornate, just a slate panel nestled at the edge of the woods, with the names of Echo 7 engraved in steel beneath a raven silhouette. People came and left coins, tags, handwritten notes. Sometimes they brought items from their own families, tokens of loss and memory. And every once in a while, Marcus would visit, standing still among the trees, watching as the past and future stood side by side, in the form of strangers paying tribute to names they had only recently learned to speak aloud. Legacy, in the end, was not about erasing what had happened or pretending it hadn't hurt. It was about owning it, sharing it, and ensuring the silence that had once defined it never returned. Eli understood this inherently. So did Marcus. And though their bond was born in tragedy, it matured into something unshakable. Two souls connected by a man who had died alone in the woods, but had refused to let his story end there. And as more people came to understand what the ghost mark truly meant, it evolved from a cryptic symbol into a beacon. Not of pain, but of perseverance. Not of revenge, but of redemption. It was ink that refused to fade because the memory it held wasn't finished. It was still unfolding, still guiding, still anchoring those drifting too far from truth. For Marcus and Eli, the mission was no longer about one unit, one cover-up, or one man's redemption. It was about all of them, every soldier who had ever been silenced, every family left with nothing but questions, every soul who had felt forgotten by the very system they served. And together they made sure none of them stayed invisible. It had been nearly a year since the story of Echo 7 broke into the public eye, and yet in many ways, for Marcus, the real journey had only just begun. The external noise, the headlines, the ceremonies, the inquiries, had faded into the background like the distant echo of a fading storm. But what remained was deeper, more profound, and infinitely more personal. He had come full circle in ways he never expected, from a man who once lived hidden behind a wall of solitude and buried trauma, to someone others sought out not just for his past, but for the insight and clarity he now carried like a torch in the dark. And though he had resisted the role of mentor, leader, or advocate in the beginning, it had found him anyway, not because he asked for it, but because he had earned it in the silence, in the fire, and in the aftermath. One crisp morning in early autumn, Marcus sat on the back porch of his cabin with a fresh cup of black coffee and the familiar weight of his old field journal on his lap. The trees were beginning to change, their gold and rust-red leaves whispering secrets to one another in the breeze, and the air held that perfect tension between warmth and cold that only existed for a few fleeting weeks each year. He found himself writing again, not battle notes or mission reports, but reflections, thoughts, pieces of truth that might never make it into public record, but mattered just the same. He wrote about silence and what it did to a man, about legacy and how it could shape itself in the hands of the willing, about Franco, and the choice to die in truth rather than live under deception. And most of all, he wrote about Eli, not just who he was, but what he had become. Eli had grown in ways that were difficult to describe without resorting to grand metaphors, but Marcus didn't need poetry to know what was real. He saw it in the boy's eyes now, measured, patient, and unshakably clear. He saw it in his gait, in the way he walked with purpose, not toward fame or validation, but toward meaning. Eli had become a silent pillar for others to lean on. Veterans twice his age listened when he spoke. Activists invited him to strategy meetings. Even lawmakers had started reaching out. And yet he had never sought credit, never accepted interviews, never let anyone turn his story into spectacle. He simply carried the truth forward, step by step, like Franco had taught him, and like Marcus had helped refine. Size. One day, Eli came to Marcus's cabin with a folder under his arm. Inside were drafts for something new, an educational program he was developing with a nonprofit focused on intergenerational military trauma. The idea was to create a framework for storytelling as healing, where veterans and their children could work together to unravel the threads of silence that had kept them emotionally divided for so long. Marcus read the drafts in silence, page by page, watching as words poured from Eli with clarity and intent. It was more than promising. It was vital. And when he reached the last page, he nodded once and said nothing, simply handing the folder back with a look that told Eli everything he needed to know. This is it. Keep going. But not all of the echoes from the past had been laid to rest. One afternoon, Marcus received an unmarked envelope in his mailbox. No return address, no markings beyond his name. Inside was a photograph, blurred, taken at a distance but unmistakable. A man walking into a nondescript building outside of Phoenix. A man who looked strikingly like one of the officers Marcus had testified about during the hearings. A man presumed to have disappeared into early retirement. Alongside the photo was a single typed sentence, "Not all ghosts stay buried." Marcus stared at the image for a long time. He knew what it meant and what it didn't. There would always be those who refused to face accountability, who found new masks to wear, new structures to hide behind. The truth might be out now, but that didn't mean the shadows were empty. He didn't show the photo to Eli right away. He needed time to think, time to weigh the cost of pulling the boy deeper into a world that had already shaped him with fire. But eventually he did. Eli looked at the photo, said nothing for several minutes, then folded the paper and set it down. Marcus expected questions, maybe concern, maybe even anger. But instead, Eli simply said, "We keep moving, we build forward, but we stay aware." That was all. A simple creed. A strategy rooted not in fear, but wisdom. And in that moment, Marcus realized that legacy wasn't just about passing down names or causes. It was about transferring judgment, discernment, the quiet strength, to decide what deserved action and what deserved to be let go. Eli understood that now, better than anyone. Later that week, Marcus drove out to the edge of town, where the new memorial annex had just been completed. Unlike the first site, which focused solely on ECH-07, this annex held space for other units, other stories, ones still being unearthed thanks to the momentum Echo 7's exposure had triggered. The wall was simple. Black stone, curved slightly like a shield, etched with rows of names and call signs. Marcus found his place in the reflection again, not as a broken man, not as a relic, but as someone who had found his way back to clarity, one painful truth at a time. He stood there for a long while, letting the breeze cut gently through the silence, and thought about how far they'd come, how far they still had to go, and how, for the first time in a very long time, he was okay with the unknown. He returned to his cabin just after sundown, the sky streaked with gold and ash. Eli was waiting for him, seated on the porch step, nursing a mug of chamomile tea. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. The mission had changed. The war had changed. But their purpose remained. The same quiet promise that had been born from a ghost mark passed down in silence, and now carried forward with intention. And Marcus knew, in the marrow of his bones, that they had only just begun to understand the true scope of what had been set in motion. The air in Elmridge grew colder as the last of autumn gave way to winter's quiet advance, and with it came the soft, contemplative hush that settled over the town, like snowfall before the storm. Life continued, but everything felt subtly different now, as if the very rhythm of the community had realigned itself around something deeper, more meaningful. For most of the locals, Marcus Wynne had become something of a myth, not the elusive, shell-shocked recluse he once was, but the man who stood at the edge of silence and dragged the truth out of its grave. He had not chased celebrity, nor did he bask in attention, but his presence carried gravity. Veterans from nearby counties began quietly dropping by his cabin just to talk. Sometimes they brought old stories, sometimes old wounds. Sometimes they just wanted to sit with someone who understood the invisible weight that years of unspoken memories pressed into a man's shoulders. Marcus always made time for them. Never out of obligation, but out of instinct. It was what Franco would have done. The fireplace in his cabin crackled constantly now, fed by cords of chopped wood that Eli had taken to stacking every few weeks like clockwork. The boy had become a fixture there, not as a guest, but as a second inhabitant of the space. He moved easily between the coffee shop and the cabin, between town life and the increasingly widespread ripple effect of the silent marks. Invitations for panels and events still came weekly. Universities, veteran groups, international forums. Most Eli declined, not because he didn't value their platform, but because he understood something few others did. Impact wasn't measured in applause. It was measured in the quiet, in the lives, shifted gently by example. He'd seen what happened when trauma was sensationalized, when stories became headlines instead of healing. And he refused to let Echo 7's truth become just another viral memory. The educational program Eli had designed was now in its pilot stage across 3 states, drawing attention from military family networks, school counselors, and nonprofit mental health organizations. The premise was simple: create a safe space where family members of veterans could listen, share, and reconnect through story. Marcus had been skeptical at first, unsure that civilians could truly understand the depth of military scars, but after sitting in on one of the sessions through a live feed, he was stunned into silence. A middle-aged woman, daughter of a Marine lost during a classified mission, stood in front of a classroom of teenagers and read a poem she had written when she was 15, 2 weeks after her father's funeral. Her voice trembled but never broke. At the end, she said, "No one ever told me it was okay to still have questions, but now I know the asking is part of remembering." And in that moment, Marcus understood. Eli had built something real. The cabin began to change too, evolving from a lone man's hideout to a quiet sanctuary. Marcus made space for others now, books lining the shelves on topics he once would have ignored, a second chair always pulled out at the kitchen table, extra gear ready for hikes when visitors wanted to walk and talk. He never advertised his door was open, but those who needed it always seemed to find their way. Veterans who had been silenced, families who had been forgotten, a few even from overseas. One, a retired British operative who had lost his team in a similarly classified mission near Helmand Province, came all the way from Devon just to sit with Marcus and say thank you. He brought no documents, no proof, just a pendant etched with an unfamiliar insignia and a tearful story of betrayal. Marcus said little in return, just clasped the man's shoulder with quiet understanding. Sometimes, solidarity didn't need translation. One evening, after a particularly long day sorting archival reports for a new testimony Della had asked him to review, Marcus sat with Eli by the fire, both men nursing mugs of bitter coffee. Outside, snow had begun to fall, covering the porch in a soft white blanket, the kind of night that made everything feel suspended, timeless. Eli had been quieter than usual, eyes distant but calm. Eventually he turned to Marcus and said, "Do you think he knew, Franco, that this would happen?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. He stared into the fire, watching as a log cracked in half and crumbled into embers. Then he said, "I think he didn't care if it happened. He just knew someone had to try." That was the difference. It wasn't about being certain. It was about refusing to accept silence as the final chapter. Mesh. Eli nodded slowly. A few moments later, he retrieved a box from his bag. Inside was a folded flag, standard issue, crisp, untouched. "It's his," Eli said. "They finally tracked it down. Sent it to me with a letter saying it had been misfiled." Marcus took the flag in his hands, the weight of it heavier than he expected. He stared at the stars, stitched in a perfect pattern, and felt a strange peace settle over him. Not closure, there would never be such a thing, but continuity, as if one thread had been placed directly into his hand, asking him to carry it just a little further. In the days that followed, they began drafting a letter to be read aloud at the next Silent Mark Summit. Marcus insisted Eli write it, and Eli reluctantly agreed, though he had no interest in speaking it himself. Instead, they chose a young Marine, who had been one of the first beneficiaries of the new storytelling program. His voice would carry the message forward. It was fitting. It was right. The letter was simple, powerful, and written from both of them. It spoke of memory not as a burden, but as a responsibility, of truth not as a weapon, but as a salve. It ended with a single line that Marcus had underlined twice before sealing the envelope. "Legacy is not what we leave behind. It's what we choose to carry forward together." As snow deepened outside and winter settled into the bones of the valley, Marcus felt something lift in him, not all at once, but gradually. He didn't need headlines or recognition. He had already won the only battle that mattered, reclaiming the truth, honoring the fallen, and ensuring their memory wouldn't fade into silence. And with Eli beside him, still steady, still quiet, still determined, he knew the mission would endure long after both of them had passed. Because some stories don't end. They echo. The snowfall thickened over Elm Ridge, layering the town in quiet white, softening every sound and slowing every footstep until it felt as though the entire world had exhaled. The streets glowed in the faint amber of winter lamps, the coffee shop's windows fogged from the heat inside, where laughter and murmured conversations flickered like candlelight. Timberline Grounds had become more than a business. It was a gathering place, a quiet sanctuary, a living memorial built on small comforts and larger truths. Eli moved behind the counter with practiced grace, serving cups, refilling sugar jars, answering with warm nods rather than wasted words. He had learned to live in the present while carrying the past, and people sensed that. They didn't come to him for grand revelations. They came because his presence reminded them that it was possible to keep going. That morning, Marcus had risen early, as always, and taken his walk through the woods behind his cabin. The path had become familiar, each tree and bend in the trail a marker in his internal map. His boots crunched softly on frozen earth as he passed the clearing where he once sat in silence and let grief hollow him out. Now, it was different. The air felt colder, but not empty. In that same clearing stood a simple wooden bench, one that Eli had built and placed without fanfare the previous spring. Carved into the backrest, in the same angular script that had once formed the ghost mark, were the words, "Your memory marches with us." No dates, no names, just the promise of remembrance. He sat there now, letting the silence press gently around him, and thought not about the past, but about everything that had grown from it. Across the country, more chapters of the Silent Marks had been established, not just by soldiers, but by nurses, interpreters, drone pilots, and even civilian contractors who had once believed their experiences were unworthy of acknowledgement. Each group found its own rhythm. Some focused on policy, others on peer healing. Some simply met to listen and be heard. A network had formed, held together not by uniform or rank, but by conviction, that no story deserved to rot in secrecy if it had the power to help someone else survive. Marcus had read dozens of letters, testimonies and transcripts, most of them anonymous, raw, unfiltered. They were hard to read, but they were necessary, because every truth unearthed helped dismantle the myth that pain must be private. Eli had recently begun work on a second program. This one focused on transition, guiding veterans from battlefield to civilian life, from mission mindset to personal clarity. It included job mentorship, emotional literacy, and something Marcus found deeply resonant: identity reconstruction. He believed the military taught men how to fight, but not how to come home. Eli wanted to bridge that gap, and he had the rare insight to do it, not as someone who had worn the uniform himself, but as someone raised in its long shadow, shaped by its echoes. Where most saw a veteran, Eli saw the entire chain of cause and consequence. Where most asked what happened over there, Eli asked, "What are you carrying now?" Back at the cabin, Marcus had taken to working with his hands again. He had forgotten how much he enjoyed it. The grounding repetition of shaping wood, fitting joints, sanding rough edges down into something usable. He and Eli had built shelves, benches, even a storage chest, now housed in the coffee shop's back room where guests could leave letters or keepsakes meant for lost comrades. They called it the Raven Box. Each item inside was logged, photographed, and archived by volunteers from the Silent Mark's central hub. One day, those artifacts would become part of a permanent exhibit, an unofficial museum of the unseen, a monument not to war but to survival. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of steel, Marcus made his way back to the cabin, his scarf pulled tight around his neck, a fresh layer of snow dusting his shoulders. He stopped only once, at the edge of a ridge that overlooked the valley, the same ridge where, once upon a time, he had questioned whether any of this mattered. He looked out now and saw lights glimmering through the trees. Not just the towns, but scattered points along the trail, new cabins, new fires. Other people who had come to Elm Ridge seeking the same peace he once thought impossible. The town had grown. Or perhaps, it had simply allowed itself to be seen. Meaty. Inside the cabin, a fire already crackled in the hearth. Eli was there, seated on the floor with a box of documents open beside him. Reports, outreach proposals, correspondence. He looked up as Marcus entered, offered him a nod, and slid a mug of tea across the low table without a word. They sat in silence for a while, the quiet hum of the evening wrapping around them like a familiar coat. Eventually, Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to Eli. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in Marcus's careful, no-nonsense script. It wasn't a letter. It was a transfer of something greater. "I'm naming you co-archivist," the note read. "Not because I need help, but because someone else needs to carry this when I'm gone." Eli read it, then folded the paper and placed it carefully in the journal that still bore Franco's final entry. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. His eyes, steady and fierce, said more than gratitude ever could. And so they sat there, two men, shaped by memory, defined not by what they had lost, but by what they had chosen to carry forward. The storm that once raged had passed. The silence that once ruled had been broken. In its place stood a new truth, not louder than the world's noise, but deeper than it, built slowly, brick by brick, story by story. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the mission endured. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.